Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I can see Jim is back there. Howdy, Jim. Let me
Hi,
go over a
Matt.
few let me go over a few quick things, and then we'll jump into Jim's presentation. I know people are excited for that. So, again, thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the director of programs here at Montgomery History, and we're glad you're here. If you would like to make a donation, hold on. Back up. We do appreciate you joining us. We also want to give a special thank you to everyone who's made a donation to support Montgomery history. Your support helps us offer free programs like this, and we are very grateful for that. If you'd like to make a donation to help continue offering free programs like this, you can visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org and click Donate Now. Of course, we are also in the middle of our major campaign for our new building for Courthouse Square. So you hopefully have been receiving emails for that. We're really excited for that new space. We are just as a little teaser. They were looking at putting up some paint colors on the outside of the building to restore it to its original colors. Let me move my camera right there today. So we got a little bit of a preview. If you wander downtown, it's downtown Rockville, you can take a look at that. So keep an eye out for that. More coming very soon on that. Of course, we'll have a recording of this presentation available on our website next Monday around 10 o'clock. And if you really like the program, Jim also gives the talk through our Speakers Bureau. So if you've got a group that would appreciate it, reach out to me and we can get that set up for your group. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to send those via the Q&A button. We will get to as many of those at the end of the program as possible. And next week, we'll have a History Conversations Rewind on teaching history at the U.S. Naval Academy, which will also be available next Monday. Okay, those are all of my important announcements. Again, we'll do questions at the end of the program. I'm going to go ahead and stop my slideshow here. And Jim, whenever you are ready to get started, you can do so. We'll get your screen share going.
I'm screen sharing now.
Yep. it's showing me. So
there it goes.
there we go.
You,
yep.
okay. All right.
Yep. And
thank
then
you.
Jim, actually, before you get started, so next to the stop sharing button, there's a little thing that says hide.
Yes,
Like
I see
that.
that.
That'll hide that. Yeah, but if you hide, that'll hide the little bar that says it's sharing. Yep. And then you can just start your slideshow from there. So,
Okay.
all right,
I'm
I'm
going
done
to
talking.
start this from the beginning. Thank you, Matt. And thank you all for listening into this. Good afternoon. The Maryland Colonization Society, my only introductory remarks about this is you're going to find this to be one of the most bizarre, unconventional stories you've ever heard. Probably you've never heard a lot of this stuff, but we'll start. I got interested first when I wrote the book on Yarrow Mammoet, who incidentally was painted by James Alexander Simpson in 1822. And in that book, I said that his son moved from Montgomery County up to Washington County with the help of the Claggett family, and that the Clagetts were progressives because they were members of the American Colonization Society. And several Black history professors said very kindly to me, you shouldn't say that they were progressive. They were really, that's a terrible thing. You should never be complimentary about the American colonization movement. So I dropped the subject. But then 3 years ago, a woman who I think may be watching today came to me with this portrait. And I identified her as Mary Ann Cassell, again painted by the same Georgetown artist, James Alexander Simpson, in 1839. She was of mixed race. She married William Cassell and went to the colony in Africa with him. And that interested me in colonization, and I ended up with the Maryland Colonization Society, which is the group that sponsored her going to Africa. If we look at a map of Africa, this was the what was called the Slave Coast. This is where all the slave ships got enslaved people and took them to the New World. And going to focus on Liberia is what became the colonization movement's country. And we zoom in here, you see Liberia here, but let me start up here at the top left with Freetown. The British started this colonization movement in 1787. There was a black ghetto in London, and they decided that they would move those people to Africa. It would be better for them and clean up London. So they started a colony in Freetown for people from London. And then in 1792, there was a group of blacks up in Nova Scotia that had fought for the British during the American Revolution. And the British government moved those people again to Freetown. So that started the idea of having colonies in Africa for people in the Western countries who had been brought to those countries through the slave trade. The United States focused on Monrovia here in the center, named after James Monroe because he gave military help to it. And I'm going to be talking about Harper, which was down here at the bottom. And what I do with that is, this is not working right. Anyway, it is now Maryland County. The Maryland Colonization Society had a colony based at Harper, and this whole section of Liberia to this day is called Maryland County. The American Colonization Society was founded in December 1816, and among its founders were these two men, Bushrod Washington. He was George Washington's nephew. He owned Mount Vernon. He was the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court. He owned slaves. And so this bizarre things we're starting to discover. He led the American Colonization Society. He was president. He was the big name. Another big name was Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. He had been a lawyer, and he was a lawyer in Washington, D.C. He represented both enslaved people and people who owned slaves. So he represented both sides. He, too, personally owned slaves. So these two men founded it in December 1816. And the purpose of the society is stated in the charter, and this is verbatim, to promote and execute a plan for colonizing, with their consent, the free people of color residing in our country, in Africa or such other places as Congress shall deem most expedient. Well, they planned to get Congress to help. I don't think Congress ever gave them any money. James Monroe did lend them naval support, especially protection. But the most interesting thing about this is December 1816. Within several weeks, there was a group of African American associations called the Mutual Relief Association in Georgetown, composed of skilled craftsmen and businessmen and shopkeepers. And at its meeting in late December, the first member spoke up about this, and he wanted to remain where he was, meaning in Georgetown or Maryland, because his parents lived and died in the land, and he was very desirous that his remains be laid alongside them. But then Joseph Moore, who was a shopkeeper in Georgetown, also African American, rose in perfect opposition. Moore wanted a colony, but in America, not Africa. He argued the colony needed to be under the protection of the general government of the U states. He felt land should be set aside in unsettled territory along the Missouri River. So did a man who had been a soldier in the American Army and who, along with other black soldiers, had been awarded land in the West in exchange for their service. A majority of those at the meeting favored creation of black settlements within the United States and voted to submit a petition to this effect to Congress. So immediately you have this group of free blacks in Georgetown saying, oh, yeah, we like the idea, but not in Africa. Abdul Rahman is a famous man. It was a PBS program called Prince Among Slaves. He had been enslaved in Africa, brought to America, was enslaved in Mississippi for many years, and then finally was brought to the East Coast, brought to Washington, freed, and sent back to Liberia, Monrovia, where he died. But sadly, that's the problem. One of the problems of going to Africa is these people don't have immunity to the diseases. But all of this was done by the American Colonization Society, and he was sort of the I don't like the word too much, poster boy, but I mean, he was sort of their most famous person that they had sent to Africa. The Maryland Society was founded the next year, and it was supposed to be really a fundraising arm for the National American Colonization Society, as there were such societies in other states. The president was Robert Goodloe Harper, who had been a general in the Revolution, and the town of Harper in the colony was named for him. Another founder was Benjamin Henry Latrobe II. His father was the architect of the Capitol, Benjamin Latrobe. Another one was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the famous Carroll family of Maryland. Margaret Sprigg Mercer was both a colonization person and an abolitionist. And there's a great difference. Colonization people were just going to send free blacks to Africa. Abolitionists wanted to free the enslaved people. So she was in favor of both. Her father had been governor of Maryland and also had fought in the Revolution. And I'm going to talk a bit about her later, but she was one of the founders. And then these two men, Moses Shepherd, a Quaker from Baltimore. Most of the founders were from Baltimore. And George McGill, a black businessman from Baltimore. He too went to the colony in Africa on several occasions. And so did Moses Shepherd. The reason the Maryland Society was so important was that Maryland had the largest free black population in the United States. And this is the number of free blacks in Maryland by year. The society really began sending immigrants to Africa in the 1830s, at which point you can see there are 52,938 free blacks in Maryland, according to the census. So Maryland's role in this was major in terms of the importance of sending free blacks out of the country. Now, this brings up Mary Ann Cassell again. She was painted by James Alexander Simpson in 1839. As I said, a mixed race, and she married William Cassell, who was one of the major figures in the Maryland colonies. And I've used her to personalize this story so you can see how it happened with one family. But it's also where it begins very bizarrely. Her mother was named Henrietta Steptoe. She was born in slavery at Stratford Hall in 1779. This is the largest Lee plantation of the great Lee family of Virginia. It was owned by Philip Lee at the time she was born. Actually, she was born after he died, but she was considered part of his property and disposed of as his property. So, and that becomes where it gets even more bizarre. The man who handled all of this estate for Philip Lee was his brother, Richard Henry Lee. Richard Henry Lee is a major figure in American history. We just finished the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It was Richard Henry Lee who introduced into the Continental Congress in June of 1776 a proposal to declare independence. So he was the spark that led to the Declaration of Independence. And he's the executor of the state, and he's the one who's handling Henrietta Steptoe. But in 1758, and this is the very curious thing, he introduced a bill in the Virginia House of Burgess to impose a tariff on the importation of slaves that would be so high as to abolish the slave trade. He wanted to abolish the slave trade. And in this speech, which I'm quoting from, he gave two reasons, and these reasons would go through the colonization movement as well. First, because they, the slaves, see us enjoying every privilege and luxury, and because they observe their masters possessed of liberty which is denied to them, while they and their posterity are subjected forever to the most abject and mortifying slavery. And he went on to say, they will rebel. So the first reason he gives to abolish the slave trade is because if the United States keeps importing slaves, it will lead to slave rebellions, which all the slave owners feared. And the second reason he gives is moral. We, Christians, and he emphasized that word, may be furnished with our fellow creatures, meaning may own, who are no longer considered as created in the image of God as well as ourselves, and equally entitled to liberty and freedom by the great law of nature. But they are to be deprived, forever deprived, of all the comforts of life, and to be made the most wretched of the humankind. So he gives the two reasons for his bill that became the reasons for colonization, that is, the fear of a slave rebellion and morality. Richard Henry Lee passed Henrietta, the enslaved woman, to his brothers, to his niece, who lived here at the Lee Fendall House in Alexandria. The girl's mother married Fendall, and therefore all of that follows. And then the girl married Ludwell Lee. Ludwell Lee is Richard Henry Lee's son. This is the Lee family. Ludwell Lee married his first cousin, Philip Lee's daughter, and by that acquired Henrietta Steptoe. And in 1802, he freed her, a manumission certificate in the Virginia court. He then moved to this place, Belmont in Loudoun County, Virginia. He had this built, and it was big. It still exists. It's a country club now. And he became president of the Loudoun County American Colonization Society. He also owned slaves. Richard Henry Lee owned slaves. Philip Lee owned slaves. All the Lees owned slaves, but they had this bizarre relationship in their minds of somehow or other believing that it was wrong, or it's unclear how they worked that equation. The other interesting thing about this is when he died, when Ludwell Lee died in 1836, the house was purchased by Margaret Sprigg Mercer, the abolitionist who had founded the Maryland Colonization Society. And when she died, the house was purchased by George Kephart, who was the person who bought the Franklin and Armfield slave trade in Alexandria in the 1840s. So it goes from a Lee to an abolitionist and then to a slave trader. So you have all these things going on. All of that point is that Henrietta Steptoe, who's going to be my subject's mother, had this background of people, white people in their life who were involved with colonization. Whether that influenced her daughter, I don't know. So now we turn to the Maryland Colonization Society. The prime book was written by Richard Hall. This is it, On Afric's Shore. It's online at the Maryland State Archives. It's a marvelous book. Richard Hall says I like Richard Hall because he sort of takes after me and going down rabbit holes. And he writes in the introduction that he was a student at Johns Hopkins, and he went over to the Maryland Historical Society that had all the records for the Colonization Society, and he started writing papers. And ultimately, for this book, he said there were 60 boxes of files from the Maryland Colonization Society. He transcribed all the letters from people in the colony in Africa back to the society in Baltimore. And something, fantastic job, and then put all of it in this book. And as you're going to see a sample later, there were 1,100 people who were sent to Africa by the Maryland Colonization Society. To the extent he could, he put an appendix in the book with a biography of each of those individuals. But as I said, slave rebellions were really one of the factors that led the colonization movement. And in 1831, Nat Turner Rebellion in Southern Virginia caused the Maryland legislature to, react. And so it was largely dominated by Eastern Shore planters who owned slaves. And so it passed this bill, act related to the people of color. Just looking at the bold type, the purpose was to remove from the state of Maryland the people of color now free, and such as shall hereafter become so, to the colony of Liberia and Africa, or such other place or places out of the limits of this state as they may approve of. Going to get rid of the black people if we can. And the Maryland legislature appropriated $20,000 to spend for the Maryland Colonization Society. So the Maryland legislature is supporting colonization, but not for the good reason. Or, I mean, the legislature itself doesn't appear to be acting for the good reason. It wasn't the moral reason. They were worried about slavery revolts. And there was this ongoing thing that slaves themselves would not rebel, but it was the free blacks who were the instigators of it. So if you got rid of the free blacks, you wouldn't have slave rebellions. It's a crazy notion, but it prevailed. Now I turn to William Cassell, who would marry Mary Ann. Their marriage was in 1839, but in 1833, he and his first wife went to the colony, Cape Palmas, in what is Liberia. Cape Palmas is about 400 miles south of Monrovia. It was the Maryland Colonization Society picked it because it thought it was healthier for one reason. And it also wanted to be independent of the Monrovia Liberian country. So this was designed to be a separate country, but at the moment it was going to be a colony run out of the businessmen in Baltimore. And as you can see, he was a barber and a saddler. And I'm going to get into the rest of his biography in a minute. This is what Cape Palmas looked like in this era. It was a promontory that juts out into the Atlantic Ocean. The Americans built American-style houses on this promontory here. There were, in addition to the health benefits, it was said that trouble developed with the indigenous people. The Americans could be evacuated by ship. In addition, if there was trouble, this promontory gave them the opportunity to use a military force to close off the promontory. This is another picture of the houses. These houses belong to the Episcopal missionaries. One of the movements was also driven largely a lot by the churches, and this whole idea of missionary work, converting the Africans to Christianity, got impetus from these colonies. And so the Methodists sent missionaries there. The Episcopal mission was run out of Philadelphia, and it sent missionaries there. The Catholics sent 3 Jesuits there, but it was said that the Jesuits rarely left their house. They never went to preach or convert the indigenous people, and ultimately they just sort of disappeared. But there were problems with this whole missionary effort. One incident that Richard Hall talks about in his book is that the indigenous people had nativist religions and they had their own practices. And so one day they took a woman who they claimed was a witch. The natives took her down to the beach, made her drink poison, and left her there overnight. When they came back the next morning, she was still alive. At this point, the missionaries heard what was going on. One of them rushed to the beach, and the villagers said they were going to kill the woman, and the missionaries intervened and said, "You can't do that." And it left the villagers with a very bad taste in their mouth that the missionaries were interfering with their own work. Now, here's another view of it. You'll see this later. There's a lighthouse on that point, but the local population, the local villagers, were a tribe called the Grebos, and they were used to Westerners. The Portuguese had sailed up and down that coast in the 15th century, and so they were used to Europeans coming by. Many of them could speak a kind of English, and so they did not necessarily welcome the American colonies being set up there, but they got paid for it. They didn't quite know what, I don't think they understood quite what that meant in Western terms of ceding the land. But they got along well and fairly well. Richard Hall compares it to the British colonists and the Indians in North America early on, where you have the two cultures living together in this sort of uneasy relationship. The first governor was John Brown Russwurm, came in about 1834 and then died in 1852. He was born in Jamaica. He was a mixed race. He had gone to Bowdoin College and yet agreed to become governor and move to Africa with the Colonization Society. But it's being run out of Baltimore. And then in 1839, Mary Ann married William Cassell and took his name. This is their wedding picture. This is, as some of you may know, one of the most unusual pictures in the world. I believe it is the first time a formerly enslaved woman, i.e. Henrietta Steptoe, paid for an artist to paint another African-American, her daughter, Mary Ann Cassell. And so this, we pretty much identified this as probably a wedding picture done in connection with her marriage in 1839. And again, William Cassell, this was his second marriage. He had gone to Africa initially in 1834 with his wife. She got sick. They came back to Maryland and she died. So he remarried in 1839. We don't know, I don't know where they lived, but he stayed in Baltimore until 1848 when he went back to Liberia, back to the colony, because he was going to be appointed Chief Justice. It said that he had been studying law under Hugh D. Evans, one of the vice presidents of the Maryland Colonization Society. If you did that, that's the way you became a lawyer. But since Cassell was black, he had no chance of being a lawyer in Maryland then. So I think his reason for going back to Africa was to use his legal education. As Chief Justice, there really weren't courts there. In total, 1,100 people were sent to the Maryland colony. So at most, there were 1,100 people there, plus children, but generally about 1,000 people or less living there all the time. And so I think in addition to, I don't think there were much of a court system. I think he was really being the attorney general for the colony, representing the colony in terms of legal things. And in 1853, when the colony got its independence, William Cassell was the one who came back to Baltimore and negotiated that. Here's how he described conditions in 1849. Older settlers had a terrible time as there was very little wage labor available, and the governor refused to hire them when new arrivals needed work. Common necessities like flour and salt meat were never available. Single women and old men had no way to support themselves. 2 or 3 individuals were now getting rich, buying up the colony store surplus and selling it at a high profit in the black market. The society in Baltimore was sending money and goods to the colony in Africa. There were some farms there. The natives would sell produce to the colonists, but it was tough all the way around. The author Richard Hall reached this conclusion after reading all their correspondence. Settlers were aware of their isolation from other centers of power and culture. Monrovia was at least a week's travel away by ship, and America was even farther. Ships could make the passage in as little as 28 days, but the average was more like 40 days and often could take even longer. Separation by the ocean is a recurrent theme in settler letters home. Settlers look back on America with a sense of longing for family, friends, and material things left behind, mingled with bitter frustration that more did not follow them. And Mary Ann Cassell did not follow William, her husband, when he went there in 1848. She stayed in the United States. And then in 1850, her mother, Henrietta Steptoe, died in Georgetown. And that, I think, freed Mary Ann to go to Africa with her husband. But a couple of things. This is Henrietta's obituary in the Georgetown newspaper, and it said she will be remembered as a humble friend and faithful nurse. She was actually very wealthy for those times. This is her tombstone in Holyrood Cemetery in Georgetown. It's the largest flat tombstone in the cemetery. She was wealthy enough to have this very large tablet put over her grave. And of course, she had her daughter educated. And I didn't say that, but Mary Ann and her sister were educated in Georgetown. So Henrietta Steptoe became very wealthy as a single woman in Georgetown in the 1820s through 1850. This freed Mary Ann to go to, I think, Africa. And here's the Daily Globe in December 1850, the same year that her mother died. And it reported that she and Judge Cassell and Lady, that's Mary Ann, Reverend C.C. Hoffman and Lady of the Episcopal Mission were going from Philadelphia down through Baltimore and then to Cape Palmas. And Mrs. Beecraft was along. This is Elizabeth Beecraft. I think she was related to Mary Ann Beecraft or Anne Marie Beecraft, who ran the School for Colored Girls in Georgetown, and who has a hall named after her at Georgetown University. And as you see, not necessarily Marylanders were sent to the Maryland colony. There were people from other states sent there as well. And this says, and this is the Baltimore Sun. The Maryland Colonization Society have reason to be proud of their enterprise in building this fine bark, the ship, and putting her regularly between this port and the colonies in Africa. Every voyage only adds testimony to the wisdom of their scheme. So they're praising the Colonization Society for its work. And then I took this to sort of wrap it up through the 1851. The American Colonization Society had spent $1.25 million and opened 600 miles of seacoast, redeeming it from the slave trade, and a flourishing Christian state founded on the African coast with a population of about 150,000, but those are chiefly natives. The number of immigrants sent out of the American Society was about 6,116, and then there were about 800 from the Maryland Society at this time. But you'll see at the bottom here, it points out that some of these people were born free. 165 of them purchased their freedom, but the great majority of them were emancipated by their owners with a view to going to Liberia. It also points out that there were people sent to Liberia who were not Americans. The liberated Africans on the ship Pons that the United States government seized after the slave trade was abolished were sent to Monrovia, and the same thing happened to a much lesser extent to the Maryland colony. But there was always, by the way, it was always a threat to these colonies that the slave traders might just go down to the colony and grab people off the streets and take them away in the slave trade. And so protection from the United States Navy was important. The Maryland Society severed its relationship with the colony, liberated the colony in 1853. And this is a book written at the time. It's not nearly as good as Richard Hall's book by John Latrobe, brother of Henry Latrobe. And the reason was the colonists in Africa, in the Maryland colony, wanted freedom. They didn't want to be under the control, under the thumb of the founders in Baltimore. They wanted to be independent and run their own country. So in 1853, William Cassell sailed back to Baltimore and got those documents signed, and the Maryland colony became an independent country of about 1,000 people. And then William Cassell died in 1856, leaving Mary Ann a widow. There is in this obituary a kind of a slap at her in this second paragraph. It says in 1848, William closed his business and embarked for Liberia, leaving his wife in this country, who gave him little promise of crossing the Atlantic for freedom or attachment. That's pretty tough. But she, however, followed him a short time later and has given strong evidence of her satisfaction with her new home. So this is in 1856. The Maryland colony is independent, very small, 1,000 people, and Mary Ann is a widow. As I said earlier, Russ Worm died in 1852. He was replaced as president by Boston Jenkins Drayton, this man. And so in 1856, he was president. And then I found this about Mary Ann in one of the records. At the invitation of Governor Drayton, this visitor said, "I dined at the residence of Mrs. Cassell, whom I at once recognized as an American lady and who served up her dinner in true American style." That was in August 1856, and everything was going fairly well, except when there was a problem with the villagers. And this is a close-up of the Maryland colony. Harper's down here. And you can see the villagers are all over here. These little villagers would often get in fights with each other over trivial matters. When Russ Worm was governor, he was very diplomatic, and he would go out to the village and he'd mediate the dispute. He was afraid that one of these disputes between the villages would boil over into something that would threaten the colony. And so he always went out and did that. Drayton wasn't as diplomatic. And so in December of 1856, when a dispute between the villages got out of hand, he organized a military force from, there are 1,000 people there. He organized a military force of 100 men with guns and cannon, and they went out to the village to suppress it with military force. He miscalculated. The villagers won the battle. Dozens of Americans were killed, and they retreated to Cape Palmas, where they were besieged. At one point, the attackers came into the town, and burned buildings, but there was no damage done in the colony. And before I leave this map, right here, I think, this is called Tubman Town. It's separate from the colony. Tubmans were a group of freed blacks from Georgia. Their owner, Emily Tubman of Augusta, Georgia, had freed them, and they all went over there together and I guess settled a separate part. The colony got its food. These are called rice fields. So the colony again got its food either by buying it from the indigenous people or in some cases having farms of their own. So you can see how dangerous it was to be on this promontory. This is how it looks today, with nowhere to go. But so finally in April of 1857, Drayton asked for help from Liberia. Liberia sent troops down, everything calmed down, and the Maryland colony, this is the Drayton signature, where the Maryland colony ceded its land and became part of Liberia under the Liberian government, thus ending its own independence after such a short time. Mary Ann went on to run the orphan asylum. It says a Liberian lady of experience in teaching and management of children in 1865. So she's running the orphan asylum. This is the orphan asylum for Native girls. I don't know whether it's truly orphan or whether it was just a school for girls. And here's another image of it in 1884, but this is after Mary Ann died, and so, but it's still the same building next to the lighthouse. She also became head of the hospital. And I always wondered, there was no indication that they had a doctor, and I kept wondering it was whether the fact that Mary Ann's mother was a nurse and midwife in Georgetown, whether she learned some medicine from that and thus qualified for running the hospital. As I said, she was Catholic, but the Catholics didn't have a church there, so she became Episcopalian, part of St. Mark's, running the mission there, and this is the church. And then she died in 1871 after running those things. The legacy of the colony in Cape Palmas, in 1853, they got their independence. 1857, they became part of Liberia. Last sponsored expedition there went in 1862 with only 15 immigrants, but only 10 of those were from Maryland. It ceased active operations in 1863, but continued supporting schools in Liberia until it finally disbanded in 1902. That's one legacy of Cape Palmas. This is how Cape Palmas looks today. It really just collapsed. Actually, the Tubmans had that Tubman farm there. One of the Tubman descendants did become president of Liberia. In fact, the longest surviving or the longest serving president of Liberia, but the town itself fell apart. This building probably dates from the 1880s or 1890s. It wouldn't be there originally. But then this article in the Smithsonian Magazine in 2016 by Claire McDougall, a Liberian woman, characterized it this way about the whole colonization movement. Instead of creating a proverbial land of liberty that made a clean break from their brutal past, the settlers, called Americo-Liberians, or if they were Africans who had been trafficked but not to the United States, Congos, lorded over the natives, denying them political rights and acting like the slave masters they had escaped. They forced natives to labor in the fields and on rubber plantations and taxed communities for merely existing. Well-off settlers donned hoop skirts and tailcoats, opened Masonic lodges, and built Methodist churches in a conscious effort to emulate the American South. So its reputation in Liberia is quite this today. The legacy in Maryland was that in January 1844, the Maryland Colonization Society board created the Maryland Historical Society because they wanted a place for their records. And so they created the Maryland Historical Society, and in a way, probably derivatively, the Montgomery County Historical Society. And now finally, since I'm speaking for the Montgomery County Historical Society, I want to say that there is no evidence that anyone from Montgomery County ever went to Harper, to the Maryland colony. There, in fact, I found no evidence that anyone in Montgomery County was a member of either the Maryland Colonization Society or the American Colonization Society. I don't know why. But in the end, just last month, Governor Wes Moore signed the historic Sister State Memorandum of Understanding with the Republic of Liberia. So despite all of this, Liberia is now a sister state of Maryland. Thank you very much. I will go back to my...
All right. Let's stop your screen share there. All right, there we go. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A button. We do have someone, Catherine asks, how did the Methodist Church get so involved in the American Colonization Society?
Well, both the Methodist and Baptist Church, especially Methodist and Baptist Church in the North, were in favor of abolition. They were leaders in the abolitionist movement. Then after the Civil War, they were leaders in setting up schools for freed slaves. So those two churches were leaders in civil rights for African Americans.
Okay. She mentions in a second comment that she has an ancestor who was a member of the AFC and a representative from Kentucky. So not that long ago, I guess, if you really think about it.
Right.
So someone asks, can you speak to the census of free Black residents of Maryland? Was this sponsored by the Colonization Society?
No, that was the national census. That, in the census, they recorded whites, and then they recorded free Blacks separately. I mean, not separately. They did record free Blacks. It was a category called others, Indians, others, and others not taxed. and that was both Indians and blacks, and the census recorded the race on that.
Okay. Well, I don't actually see any other. Oh, yeah, here we go. Who was Mrs. Castle's father? Or yeah,
Unknown. She and I mean, there weren't. I do have her birth certificate. It didn't record a father. I think it put her name. No, she when she got married, her marriage certificate listed her name as Mary Ann Tritt, Tritt. I don't know whether the Tritt was a first husband or whether Tritt was her father's name.
Okay. Are there? Oh, someone asked, are the castles of the DC area related?
I don't think so. I think that there were some castles. There have been prominent castles. I think from Baltimore, and I'm sure they are related to them. And one of the very major politicians in Liberia were Castles. I think that was William Castle's son, not his son with Mary Ann, but with his first wife, who stayed in Liberia and then continued.
This is a great question. So did the people deported, did all of them agree to go?
Yes, they had to. It was with their consent, and the society would pay their way. In fact, the American Society paid all the colonists for the first 6 months, paid them a salary. And the reason for that was stated to be, quote, for the adjustment period. Many people died in the first 6 months of disease. So that was a big risk, but they were paid for the first 6 months. And in fact, it's a really good question. Mary Ann, you had to be free in order to go. And Mary Ann, since she was born in Georgetown of a free woman, she had no papers to prove she was free. So in 1839, when she got married, she and her mother went and got manumission papers from DC in 1839 because I think she wanted to go to Africa then.
Let's see here. Was there conflict between the anti-colonization movement and the Maryland Colonization Society?
Yes. The Maryland Colonization Society thought the American Society was inept and mismanaged. And they thought they could do everything better. And that's why they went their own way. But that, it was about 15 years or 20 years before they did that.
Let's see here. Oops.
I'm glad you're reading these.
I'm responding to I'm trying to respond to one. I'm typing, so it looks like I'm looking the wrong, looking away. All right. So someone says, do you have a sense of whether there were a lot of free blacks who actually wanted to, or I guess not just free blacks, but enslaved blacks who actually wanted to go back to Africa?
Well, I don't think so. I think that quote I had early on from the Georgetown group in Georgetown saying they like colonization, but not in Africa. I think most, and the fact that William Cassell said, Richard Hall wrote in his book that the settlers in their letter was a theme that nobody wanted to come there, that even the enslaved blacks probably didn't know about it, but certainly the idea of going to this foreign place would be just rather scary, and you had to be pretty motivated.
Okay. And you may not know the answer to this question, but is there any information about a percent of the population in modern Liberia that can trace their roots back to colonization projects? Oh, I
yes,
think you do.
Yes, I can answer that question. 2 to 5% of modern Liberians are descendants of either the people from Harper or Monrovia. I think Harper was so small, its contribution was extremely small.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, this is a great one. Did the Maryland state legislature pass laws that stated manumitted or freed enslaved folks had to leave. Was there any movement to like
Yeah.
basically say that if you were free, you had to leave?
Yes. Yeah. They never were able to pass a law. Virginia did. Virginia required people who were free to leave within a year, and I think that's why Henrietta Steptoe moved from Virginia to Georgetown, is because of Virginia law. Maryland toyed with that, but to my knowledge, Maryland never passed a law like that.
Okay. I can't recall if you answered this, but someone asked why specifically Liberia was chosen.
Liberia was chosen because they wanted to clear the slave coast, number one. They wanted to stop the slave trade in that area. And I think the other reason is because the British had put their place in Freeport. I think it was also healthier than other places on the coast. I certainly know that Harper was considered a lot healthier than Monrovia.
Let's see. There's a question here. So do we know where in Maryland most people who agreed to go to Liberia came from? So what geographic location most people left from?
I didn't look at the numbers of that, but Richard Hall in his book with all the biographies of all the people that went there, I did skim that. That's how I know that no one from Montgomery County went there. Baltimore was a big location. Cecil County, Howard County, what's the other county in Northeast Maryland? Dorchester County,
yeah,
Kent County. But the Eastern Shore, it was interesting. There were slave owners who would free their slaves and then support them going to Africa. And so I did find people on the Eastern Shore who were clearly planters, who clearly had, enslaved people, who were sponsoring people to go to Africa, probably while maintaining other people in slavery.
Someone says, what else can be said about Margaret Mercer? You mentioned you would return to her, but is there anything more you can reveal about her life and career?
Well, yeah, much more. She, when she bought Belmont, she had freed her slaves. They went to Harper. She then ran a school for black girls there, and she had built a church and ran a school there. That place is still over there, just east of Leesburg. And her great niece, Lucy Mercer, had the affair with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So a little juicy tidbit. I like that question. I wasn't going to put that in the talk.
Someone asks, have you been to Liberia?
No, I have not.
Okay. Did any of the settlers return to the United States?
Not that William Cassell did, obviously, because he came back with his son and his wife. I think his wife died here. When he went back, he took his son with him. George McGill, he didn't go there as a settler, the black businessman from Baltimore. He went there and he came back. Moses Shepherd went there and came back. So I suspect that there were people who did come back, but I didn't look specifically for them.
Okay. There is a question here. I'm going to rephrase it to be a little bit more broad, I think, to kind of address the question. So you mentioned and I forget the gentleman's name, but he stood up and opposed the colonization project because he wanted to be where his parents were.
Yes.
For those who opposed colonization, was that the general reasoning why, or was there one kind of overarching theme for their opposition, or was it many different things?
Well, I think that most of the African Americans, whether enslaved or not, thought they were American. And the notion to them, the slave trade had been stopped in 1807. So by the 1820s, 1830s, the younger African Americans had been born in America. The idea that you would go back to this country that I think they knew that it was probably more primitive than the United States. And William Cassell himself said he wanted to go to Africa, but it was the place he felt truly free. So you had this split in emotions, and it's how you work that equation. Are you going to go somewhere that's pretty tough to live, that's a strange place you don't know, or do you want to get out of this racism in America?
Okay. Well, I think with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Any closing thoughts? Anything that you didn't share you want to throw in real quick?
Yeah, thanks. My closing thought, it shows you that these people were certainly the liberals. They were liberal, they were progressive, they did believe that black and white people were created equal. But you may have the best intentions, but you have a terrible, terrible plan that they didn't realize that, although it's very moral to think of this, what they were actually proposing didn't really work out well. But thank you all for listening.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jim. With that, we'll wrap things up. Again, we will have a recording posted on our website next Monday. Excuse me. I do also want to mention, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, mark your calendars for October 10th. As I mentioned in a previous talk, we are planning a special little celebration for the 250th birthday of Montgomery County, which happened to be founded the same year as our country. So stay tuned for some details about that, but pencil that into your on your calendars, put it in your phone, however you keep track of things. And we're excited to share more details about that when it happens. So again, thank you so much, Jim. Hope everyone has a great afternoon and stay safe with the potential for big storms. So we'll talk to you again soon.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.